Welcome everyone, my name is Scott and welcome back to this tutorial series on building a space shooter game with Phaser 3. Previously, we worked on adding a new weapon component so then that way our enemy and our player are able to fire bullets at each other. If you missed the previous videos, there'll be links in the video description to source code to this point, as well as complete source code for this video. There'll also be a link to the previous videos I'd like to catch up, so let's get started. So now that we have our weapon component, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to work on adding collisions to our game. And so what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to add collision checks between our player ship and our enemy ship. So then that way when they collide, they'll be destroyed. Likewise for our weapons, so our player's bullet group and our enemy ships, and our enemy's bullet group and our player ship, we're going to check for collisions between those as well. And so to do this in Phaser, there's a few different ways we can check for collisions. And when we're using physics, two of the common ways are we can use a collider or we can add an overlap. And so what a collider is, when we have our two physics bodies, so as an example, our player ship, our physics body here, and our player ship's physics body, as soon as they start touching, if we had a collider, we would start applying force to them and they would actually collide together. And so this is really good for like when our player's moving around, we don't want them to move through a wall or through the floor, versus the other way is we can check for an overlap. And how that works is we will take our ship's physics body and then check for an overlap. So between these two purple boxes, and if there's any overlap at all, we'll be notified. And so for our game, we'll be using overlaps because we don't actually need to apply any type of force to our two game objects, but we just want to know as soon as they overlap so then we actually react to that. And so to go ahead and do this, let's jump over to our game scene. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a few colliders just to see how everything works. And then we're going to go ahead and refactor this to use some of our components. And so to go ahead and use an overlap, what we need to do is we need to reference our Phaser scene. We're going to go ahead and reference our physics plugin. And now we're going to go ahead and use the add method for our factory. And we're going to add what's an overlap. And so now for our overlap, there's a few different things we can provide here. We can provide a single game object that has the arcade physics body. We could add an array of game objects, and we can even add a group. And so there's multiple ways we can check for overlaps between one and many game objects in our game. And so to start, we're going to go ahead and check for our overlap between our player ship and our enemy ship. And so what we need to do is we need to provide our two arguments here. And so we're going to go ahead and provide our player, and then we're going to go ahead and provide our enemy. So once we do this, now we can go ahead and provide a callback, so we'll be notified as soon as there's any overlap between these two physics bodies. And so we'll go ahead and provide our callback here. And so in our callback, we're actually being notified of the two game objects where our overlap is actually happening. And so this is useful when we're checking for our overlap between one and many, so like between our players' bullet group and a particular enemy group, because then we'll know exactly which two game objects are actually overlapping. And so for this, what we're going to be notified of is we're going to get our player's game object. So when we do our overlap, our callback is going to provide our arguments in the order we specify them here. And so because we have our player ship and then our enemy ship, when we get notified of this collision, it's going to be our player and then our enemy game object as well. So then what we can do in our callback now, and then I'm just going to go ahead and add a console log, and I'm just going to say collided with enemy. So if we go ahead and refresh our scene, what we should see now is our enemy ship should appear. And as soon as this physics body starts overlapping with our player ship's physics body, we can see our console log triggered. And so the next thing we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to see how we can add an overlap between our player and the weapon group so we can see how that works. And so let's go ahead and do physics. We'll do add. Let's do an overlap. So now we're going to use our player game object. Now we want to use our enemy's weapon game object. So we're going to go ahead and reference our enemy. And what we need to do is now we need to expose this so then that way we can actually reference that group. And so to do this, let's go ahead and open up our fighter enemy class. Let's go up to the top below our constructor. And what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and add a getter so we can go ahead and return this. And so we're going to go ahead and return our group and we'll return our component. So let's add a getter. So we'll do weapon, game object, group. And we're going to go ahead and return this, our weapon component. And we're going to go ahead and return our bullet group from this. And then we'll also go ahead and return the component. So we'll make a getter for that. So we'll do our weapon component. And instead of returning our group, we'll just return the weapon component. So now back in our game scene, what we should now do on our enemy class is we should have our getter. So let's go ahead and grab our weapon game object group. And so now we're passing a group of our physics game objects. And so in our callback, we're going to be notified in the same order we specified here as well. So we'll have our player game object, and then we'll have the single bullet that actually collided with our player. And so we're just going to go ahead and call this projectile game object. And then let's go ahead and we're just going to add in a console log. And just so we can verify these objects, let's add in our player game object. Then we'll add in our projectile game object. So now what should happen is when our enemy's bullet actually overlaps with our player, we should see our console log. So if we go ahead and expand this, what we should see is we should see two objects. So we have our player object here, and then we have this other object here, which is a sprite. And so this is our bullet that actually overlapped with our player. So now finally, we're going to go ahead and do the inverse of this. We'll have our enemy, we'll check for a collision with that, and our player's weapon group. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to go ahead and expose these getters as well on our player class. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to copy both of these. Let's go ahead and open up our player class. And then what we'll do is after our constructor, we'll go ahead and paste those in. Go ahead and save. All right, so now we exposed our property. Let's go ahead and jump back to our game scene. And so what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and flip our order. So we're going to have our enemy, and then we'll have our player weapon game object group. So now we'll have our enemy game object group. We'll have our enemy game object, and then we'll have our projectile game object. So we'll go ahead and update our console log. And just so it's a little bit clear, I'm going to go ahead and comment these out so we can see them. And so the reason we went ahead and switched these arguments here is when we receive our callback for our collision check between a single sprite and a group, one of the things that Phaser always does is it'll always return the single sprite first, then the sprite associated with the game object where the collision happened. So no matter what order we place these in, this is the order we'll always receive these arguments. And so just to make it consistent, by lining it up this way, it can remind us. So as an example, if we go and refresh our scene, if we fire our bullet, we'll see as soon as it overlaps with our enemy, we'll see our fighter enemy, and then we see our sprite for our bullet. And if we go ahead and reverse these, so we'll have our player weapon group first, and then we have our enemy, go ahead and fire our bullet. We'll see as soon as it overlaps, we still receive our fighter enemy game object first, then our bullet. So this is something to keep in mind while you're working with your overlaps when you check between a sprite and a group. All right, so now we see how our collisions overlap work in our game. What we're going to do next is we're going to go ahead and create two new components. So for our components, we're going to go ahead and focus on our health and our collider components. And so for our ships, when we have a collision, we're going to have this collider component that we're going to go ahead and invoke for our various type of collisions. So like when a bullet hits a ship or if a ship collides with another ship, we're going to do different logic. Our second component is going to be our health component. So instead of just having our ships automatically destroyed when we get hit by a bullet, we're going to add a health component to our ship so we can actually take some damage. And then after so much damage, then our ship would be destroyed. And then this way we'll have some gameplay variety types where if we collide with a ship, it'll just explode. If we collide with a bullet, we'll end up updating our animation to take some damage. So we're going to get started with these components. What we'll do is let's go into our components folder. And we'll go ahead and start with our health component. So let's make a new folder, and we're going to call this health. And then we'll go ahead and make a new file called health component.js. Let's export out our class. So we'll have our health component. We'll add in our constructor. And so for our health component, basically what we need to keep track of is we'll need our maximum life that we can have for our ship, and then we'll need our current life. So we're going to go ahead and add some protected properties to our class. And so we'll have our starting life. Then we'll add our current life, and then we'll add one more property to keep track if our ship is actually dead or not. And so we'll do is dead. And so now in our constructor, we'll go ahead and expect our life as our argument, and then we'll go ahead and use that to set our starting life and our current life. So we'll do our starting life is going to be equal to our life. We'll have our current life will be equal to our life. And then finally, we'll go ahead and set is dead to be false when we create our instance of our component. So now what we're going to go ahead and do is we'll add a couple getters so we can get these properties. So we'll get life, and we'll go ahead and return this, our current life. Next, we'll go ahead and add a getter for is dead, and so we'll return this is dead. All right, we're also going to go ahead and add a reset method. And so this is going to be useful for once we start using our game objects. It'll allow us to go ahead and reset our stats when we respawn our game object. So for this, we'll go ahead and set our current life back to our starting life. And we'll go ahead and reset is dead back to false. And now we need to go ahead and add in our methods for when there's a collision. And so we're going to add a method called hit. And so this will be for when we hit another game object that's not a ship. So this will be like when our bullet collides with our player ship. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to make sure that we're currently not dead. And if we are dead, we're just going to return early. If we are not dead, we want to go ahead and decrement our life. So we'll do this, our current life, we'll do minus equals 1. And now we're going to go ahead and check to see if our health is now at 0. So if our current health is less than or equal to 0, then we want to go ahead and set this is dead. We'll set it equal to true. Finally, we're going to go ahead and add one more method for dying. And so this will be for cases where we want our ship to automatically go ahead and explode. So like when our ship hits another enemy ship, or if we ever added any other type of game objects, we could call this method here. So we'll go ahead and set our current life equal to 0, and we'll do this is dead will be true. So now that we have our health component, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and build our collider component. So under our components folder, we'll make a new file. And so we'll go ahead and do a collider for our subfolder. And then for our file, we're going to go ahead and do collider component.js. We'll export our class, we'll add in our constructor. And now for this component, we're going to get a reference to the life component that this collider component's attached to. And so what we're going to do is now we'll have our collision check. So when we have that collide with enemy ship, this is where I'll call our life components and update our stats there. And so we'll have our life component. And so for our constructor, we're going to receive this as an argument. And so we'll have our life component. And now what we'll do is let's go ahead and assign that. And now we're going to go ahead and add in our two methods. And so for our game, we're going to have two methods. We'll have collide with enemy ship. And so when this happens, first we're going to go ahead and check to see if we're already dead. So if we are already dead, we won't go ahead and do anything. So we'll do if this life component is dead, let's go ahead and return. All right, and then we're going to go ahead and use our life component, and we're going to go ahead and call our die method. And so for our methods here, we're just adding some safeguards. So because when we add our overlap checks, they're fired multiple times per second, basically for every update of our game loop, our callback's going to be invoked. And so it's happening many times. And so by adding these safeguards here, we're going to only run our logic when we need to. So next, we're going to go ahead and add in a collide with enemy projectile. And so this will be used for when we collide with bullets. And so we're going to go ahead and do the same thing. I'm going to just copy this logic here. But instead of calling the die method, we're just going to call the hit method. All right, so with our two new components, we're going to go ahead and add these to our various classes. So we'll go ahead and start with our player class. So at the top of our class, let's go ahead and add in our two new components. So after our horizontal movement, let's go ahead and add health component. And then we'll go ahead and add our collider component. And just so it's a little bit easier, I'm just going to copy these. I'm going to go ahead and paste them to our enemy class as well. So after our vertical movement, let's go ahead and paste those in. And then we'll do the same thing in our scout class. So let's open up scout enemy. After our movement, we'll have our health component and collider component. So now back on our player class, we're going to go ahead and add a getter. So we can go ahead and return our collider component because we'll need to call that from our game scene. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to copy this here. We'll go ahead and paste it. And so instead of returning our weapon component, let's go ahead and return our collider component. We'll make our getter to have the same name. I'm going to copy this, and then we'll do the same thing in our other classes. So we'll add our getter to our scout enemy, and then also our fighter enemy. And so one other thing we're going to do is let's go ahead and add a getter for our health component. And so we'll have our health component. And we'll copy this, and let's add it to our other classes as well. All right, so the next thing we need to do is we actually need to create instances of our health and our collider components. And so to go ahead and do this, the first thing we're going to do is let's come to our config file. We're going to go ahead and add properties for our player and enemy health, and then now we can reference them in our classes. So we're going to go ahead and do player health, and we're going to go ahead and set this equal to 4. And then for our enemies, we're just going to go ahead and give them a health of 2. So we'll go ahead and do enemy fighter health, and we'll do 2. Copy this. And we'll do enemy scout. So now back in our player class, what we'll do is after we create our weapon component, let's go ahead and do this. We'll go do our health component will be equal to a new health component. Then we'll reference our config and we'll do our player health. So that's going to do our collider. So we'll do our collider component will be equal to a new collider component. And we'll pass in our health component. And then real quick, let's jump over to our collider class. And what we're going to do is we're just going to rename this to be health component because that's what we're actually using here. All right, so with that change, we'll go ahead and come back to our player class. Let's copy these 2 lines of code. We'll jump over to our scout enemy. We'll go ahead and create our components there as well. And then we'll jump over to our fighter enemy and let's create our components. So let's go ahead and jump back over to player class. We're going to go ahead and update our imports. Let's copy these 2 lines of code. Come to the top of our class. Now let's go ahead and fix our health for our various enemies. And so for our fighter enemy, we're going to have our fighter health. scout enemy. We're going to go ahead and have our scout enemy health. And, oh, for our references, we need to add one more folder. And we'll fix that in fighter enemy. And then we'll go ahead and save. All right, so now with our changes, let's jump back to our game scene. And what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and update this, our overlap, to go ahead and call our new components. So we'll start with our player game object. We'll go ahead and call our collider component, and then we'll do collides with enemy ship. So now what we're going to do is let's copy that, and we'll also do the same thing for our enemy game object. So now if we go ahead and save, our scene should refresh. And now for us to actually do something, what we need to do is in our enemy classes and our player class and our update method, we need to check our health component and see if if we ever die. And then if so, that's what we'll go ahead and hide our game objects. So instead of destroying our game objects, because we're going to try to reuse them, we just want to make them not visible and not active to our game. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a check. So we'll do if our health component is dead in our update method. Then we want to go ahead and do this. We'll do set active or set equal to false. This set visible. We're going to set that to false as well. So then what we'll do is let's copy this, and we're going to do the same thing over in our player class. So if we go ahead and jump over to our player class, let's come down to our update method, and we'll go ahead and paste in our code. So now when our scene refreshes, we should see that when our ships collide, they now disappear from our scene. However, we can still move our game objects around, and we can see that the bodies are still being moved. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to add a safeguard where if our game object's not active, then we want to go ahead and stop doing our update logic. So what we'll do is we'll do if we are not active. So basically our ship is in a destroyed state. We don't want to do anything. So now if we go ahead and let's copy this, let's jump over to our fighter enemy class. We'll add the same thing there. Go ahead and save, and let's test one more time. So now when our two game objects collide, we'll see now our physics stops updating, and we hide our game objects and our scene. Alright, so the next thing we're going to do for our player class is we're going to go ahead and add a logic so that if we actually die, we're going to go ahead and play our animation for having our ship be destroyed. And so to go ahead and do this, we'll need to change some of our logic here. So currently we're hiding our whole container, and we're making our whole container's body not active. And what we actually want to do is we're only going to hide parts, select game objects from our container. And so we're going to want to hide our engine and our thruster, but then we're going to go ahead and have our player's ship. We're going to go ahead and have that do our animation for exploding. And so for this to work, what we're going to do is we're going to make a new method to have this logic. So we're going to go ahead and call this hide. And so what we'll do is let's copy our 2 lines of code here for we're setting our container to not be active and to not be visible. And then we want to go ahead and we're going to update our individual game objects to not be visible as well. And so we'll do this. We're going to do our ship engine sprite. We're going to do set visible, and we're going to go ahead and set that equal to false. We're going to go ahead and copy that line of code, and then we're going to do the same thing for our thruster. And so we'll have our ship engine thruster sprite set visible equal to false. And then just as a safeguard, we're going to go ahead and lock our input. And so what we're going to end up doing is we're going to end up adding logic for our lives later on, and so we'll need to make sure we lock our input until our ship respawns. And so we're just going to go ahead and set this equal to true. So now what we're going to do here is let's go ahead and call our new method. And what this is going to have the effect of doing is basically going to hide our enemy's container. And now what we want to do is we want to go ahead and make our container visible because we'll be reusing our hide method later, so we're not going to place it there. And so what we'll do is we'll do this. We're going to set visible, so our container should be visible in our scene. And then we want to go ahead and now play that animation for the explosion. And so we're going to reference our ship sprite, and we're going to go ahead and call play. And we want to go ahead for our key, we want to do explosion. And then we're going to go ahead and return so we don't run the rest of our logic in our update method. So if we go ahead and save, what should happen now is when our player's ship collides with our enemy ship, we now have that nice explosion animation. Alright, so with that collision working how we want, now we need to actually do our collision between our ships and our bullets. And so the first thing we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and add a new method to our weapon component, so then that way we have a way to make our bullets state inactive when it collides with one of our ships. So what we're going to go ahead and do is let's jump over to our weapon component. We'll come down at the bottom of our class, and what we're going to do is let's add a new method. We're going to call this destroy bullet. We'll receive one of our bullet game objects, and then what we're going to do is we're just going to call set state. We're going to go ahead and set this to 0, so then that way it should die, and then our next world step update, we're going to go ahead and disable the body, and it won't be visible. So now back in our game scene, what we want to go ahead and do is now we need to go ahead and grab our collider tied with whichever game object the collision happened. Then we'll call collide with enemy projectile. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this here. Let's get rid of our console log. I'm going to go ahead and paste it. And then we're going to go ahead and do collide with enemy projectile. Let's copy this. We're going to paste it down here. But then this is going to be our enemy game object where we grab our collider component. So the next thing we'll want to do is now we need to grab our weapon component. We need to call that new destroy bullet method. We're going to go ahead and reference the enemy that the weapon game object group is tied to. And so let's go ahead and grab our enemy. We're going to go ahead and grab our weapon component. And now we want to go ahead and call destroy bullet. And now we're going to go ahead and pass in our projectile game object. Let's copy this line of code. We're going to go ahead and paste it in our other collider as well. But now we want to go ahead and change this to be weapon component, our player's weapon component, and call destroy bullet. So now what should happen is when our enemy's bullets collide with our ship, you'll see our physics body stops updating and our game object is hidden from our scene, and then our player is not destroyed. Because what's happening is we're just now decrementing our health. And so what we can do is let's go ahead and jump over to our config, and let's go ahead and bump our player's health down to be 1. Now we'll go ahead and test, and when that bullet hits our ship, we should be destroyed because now our health is at 0. Likewise, if I change this as something like 2, it should take 2 bullets to destroy us. So if we get 1, 2, our ship will explode. Nice. All right, so then what we're going to go ahead and do is let's go ahead and test shooting at our enemy player. We'll see after 2 bullets, our enemy ship disappears from our scene. And so just to make sure everything's working with our scout enemy, let's go ahead and uncomment this out. Go ahead and do that. All right, so before we test our scout enemy, let's go over to our class. Oh, let's go ahead and copy our logic from our update. So let's copy these lines of code here. We'll come into our scout enemy. And so now if our scene refreshes, we should be able to fire our 2 bullets. And if we can hit the enemy, we'll see they disappear from our game. Perfect. All right, so for the last thing we're going to do is when our player ship collides with our enemy's bullets, we're not actually showing any damage on our ship. So what we're going to do is we're going to add logic to update our ship's frame to show we're taking damage. And so to go ahead and do this, what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and jump over to our player class. All right, so what we're going to go ahead and do is in our update method, after we check to see if our ship is dead, what we'll do is if it's not dead, we're going to go ahead and update our frame. So to do this, we'll go ahead and do our ship sprite. We're going to call the set frame method. And then for this, we need to provide the index of the frame that we want to go ahead and set. And so for this, we're going to go on ahead and grab our config. We're going to go ahead and grab our player's health. And then we want to go ahead and subtract our health component's current life. And what that's going to do, that's going to give us how much health that our player has left. And then based on that, we're going to show a different damage frame for our ship. So real quick, if we go into our ship, we'll see here if our player's fully healed, this will be frame 0. So if we have 4 max health, we're at 4 health, we want to use frame 0. Versus if we have 3 damage, we're only going to have 1 health left. And so we want to go ahead and have this frame here. And then what we're going to go ahead and do is we're just going to go ahead and change this to a string. And so we're just going to add, and so we're going to do toString, and then we'll go ahead and save. So now if we jump back to our game scene, let's swap our enemies out so we can use our fighter enemy that'll fire our bullets. All right, so go ahead and save. We should be able to test. So when the enemy's bullet hits our ship, we should see that our ship gets updated, and when it hits it another time, it gets updated one more time. All right, so with our 2 new components in place, and we can see that our collision checks are working, that actually brings it into this video. So in our next video, what we're going to do is we're going to start working on being able to respawn our enemies, and we'll go ahead and set up object pools, so then that way we can have multiple enemies spawning in our game. So as a reminder, there's a link in the description of this video to the complete source code for this video, and as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking the video and hitting the bell icon to be notified when the next video in the series is released. For more great Phaser 3 content, please see the links on your screen now.